Florida/Colorado, United States, 1971 to 1983. The records call her Judy as Anna Lou Welty, but everyone investigating eventually called her Judy Benoano, or simply the Black Widow. In the fall of 1971, a U.S. Air Force sergeant came home from Vietnam. Within months, he was dead. A decade later, a disabled teen drowned in a canoe. Then a businessman's car exploded on a Pensacola street. In each case, the same woman stood in the shadows, collecting life insurance checks and moving quietly on. When Sergeant James Goodyear returned from his tour in Vietnam, he was 28, married to Judy, and living in Orlando. Judy changed her name to Benoano, Spanish for Goodyear, a shift both subtle and intentional. 3 months after his return, Sergeant Goodyear fell ill with nausea, vomiting, and kidney pain. He died of renal failure on September 16, 1971. At the time, doctors attributed his death to complications from his tour. Judy collected military death benefits and a life insurance policy worth about $28,000. Over the next 6 years, Judy's life shifted west. She moved to Colorado and lived with Bobby Joe Morris, introduced as a fiancé, though they never married. In January 1978, Morris died after a brief illness. His body was exhumed after suspicion arose years later and found to contain arsenic. Judy received additional insurance payouts. In May 1980, Judy took her son Michael, 19 years old, paralyzed and confined toe-heavy leg braces, on a canoe trip near Milton, Florida. She claimed the canoe tipped over in calm water. Michael drowned despite having a life jacket. Judy collected more than $100,000 in insurance money. Investigators later concluded Michael's paraplegia may have resulted from chronic arsenic poisoning and concluded that the canoe was tipped deliberately. Meanwhile, Judy began a relationship with wallpaper salesman John Gentry in Pensacola. In 1983, a bomb exploded outside his car. He was severely injured but survived. At trial, prosecutors showed that Judy had bought a $500,000 life insurance policy on him, placed poison in his medicines, and had posed as a concern partner during his hospitalization. Authorities arrested Judy on January 11, 1984. They discovered that over more than a decade, she had collected more than $240,000 in death benefits from the deaths of those closest to her. Her methods were patient, cold, efficient. She used arsenic, paraformaldehyde, and explosives, whatever the situation allowed. In 1985, Judy was tried and convicted for the 1971 murder of Sergeant Goodyear. The jury found multiple aggravating factors: premeditation, pecuniary motive, and cruelty. She was sentenced to death. In later trials, she was found guilty of the 1980 murder of her son and the 1983 attempted murder of her fiancé. On March 30, 1998, Judy Benoano was executed by electric chair at Florida State Prison in Stark. She was the first woman executed in Florida since 1848 and only the third woman in the U.S. executed since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. At 7:13 a.m., after her frail body was strapped into the chair, the switch was thrown. Smoke rose from her leg during the 38-second electrocution. She said no final words. Though convicted for 3 deaths, husband, son, attempted fiancé murder, investigators believe the true total may be higher. Judy's earlier associations and wealth gathering raised flags for deaths in Alabama, Georgia, and other states that never reached trial. Her case became a textbook study of how life insurance motives, poisonings, and staged accidents can mask serial predation. The forensic changes she spurred, exhumations, metal analysis for arsenic and paraformaldehyde, bank records tracing, remain part of investigative training to this day. In the final hours, she asked for steamed broccoli, asparagus, strawberries, and tea as her last meal. She refused to speak when asked for a final statement, simply saying no, sir. Her children remained estranged. Her ashes were scattered, and no marker stands in her name. The files remain heavy: ledger books of insurance claims, exhumation reports, schedules of medication, drafts of new names she used. In the silent stillness of evidence rooms, the handwriting of Judy Benoano appears on triggers, policies, and quiet crime. Sydney, Australia, 1997. On the morning of April 17, 1997, Susan Kennedy's small hatchback was found neatly parked at the edge of a quiet cul-de-sac in Sydney's northern suburbs. The driver's door was unlocked, the keys still in the ignition. There was a purse on the front seat containing $40, a few receipts, and her driver's license. The car was in perfect working order, but Susan was gone. She was 33 years old, a nurse at the Royal North Shore Hospital, described by friends as calm, private, and methodical. She lived alone in a small flat in Chatswood and had worked the late shift the evening before. At 11:42 p.m., CCTV from the hospital car park captured her walking toward her vehicle, her uniform folded neatly under her arm. That was the last confirmed sighting. Her absence wasn't noticed until she failed to appear for her next shift. When police entered her apartment, they found the lights off, dishes drying in the rack, and her uniform from the previous day missing. Nothing was out of place. The area where the car was found, near Garigal National Park, sits on the edge of a dense eucalyptus forest known for its steep ravines and quiet walking trails. Officers and volunteers searched for 2 weeks, using helicopters and cadaver dogs, but not a trace was discovered. Detectives began reconstructing her final hours. Susan had clocked out at 11:36 p.m. and phoned her sister at 11:50, saying she was heading home soon. The drive from the hospital to her apartment took only 15 minutes. Yet her car was later found nearly 20 minutes in the opposite direction, close to a walking path she occasionally used on weekends. Her colleagues told investigators that Susan had been unusually distracted in the days before she vanished. She had mentioned receiving hang-up calls at night, sometimes several times a week. One coworker recalled her saying that she felt like someone's following me when leaving work. The calls were traced to a prepaid phone purchased at a service station in nearby Pymble. The CCTV of that purchase showed only a man wearing a baseball cap and surgical mask. The phone was never activated again after the night Susan disappeared. Weeks later, hikers discovered a white shoe in a shallow creek bed about 3 kilometers from where the car had been left. It matched the pair Susan had been wearing that night. Nearby, searchers found an old campsite, a fire pit, a torn blanket, a metal cup, but no further evidence. The case remained open for years, occasionally resurfacing whenever remains were found in surrounding bushland. DNA testing in 2008 and again in 2015 produced no matches. Detectives interviewed a former co-worker of Susan's, a technician named David Rowe, who had resigned just days after her disappearance. He'd been reprimanded for entering staff areas without authorization, including the nurses' changing rooms. When questioned, he denied knowing anything about Susan's disappearance and claimed to have moved interstate for work. No physical evidence tied him to the scene. By 2002, the task force was reduced to 2 officers. The file became one of dozens of cold cases involving missing women in New South Wales from the 1990s. Theories range from voluntary disappearance to abduction by an opportunistic predator, but none fit perfectly. In 2019, a bushfire swept through parts of Garigal National Park, exposing layers of long-buried ground. Forensic teams combed the scorched area again, but found only fragments of wildlife bone and melted metal, no human remains. To this day, Susan Kennedy is still listed as missing. Her apartment lease was closed by family, her bank accounts untouched since the week she vanished. The car remains in police storage, dust settling across its dashboard, the clock frozen at 12:07 a.m. Ypsilanti, Michigan, December 2006. The residence halls at Eastern Michigan University were quiet that winter. Exams had ended. Most students had gone home for the holidays, and those who stayed behind often described the building as eerily still. Laura Dickinson, a 22-year-old music major, was one of those who stayed. On the night of December 12th, she watched a movie in her dorm room, sent a few text messages, and told a friend she planned to go to sleep early. She never woke up. 2 days later, a campus employee entered Laura's room during routine checks and found her lying on the floor beside her bed, partially covered with a blanket. At first, the scene appeared peaceful, no signs of struggle, no visible injuries. The responding officer initially reported that there were no indications of foul play. The university told students the same thing. It wasn't until the autopsy that the truth emerged. Laura had been sexually assaulted and suffocated. Her cause of death was determined to be asphyxia. The blanket had been placed deliberately to make her appear as if she had fallen asleep. The discovery sent shockwaves through the university and the surrounding community. For nearly 2 months, students were told there was no danger. Flyers offering counseling were distributed, but no warnings were issued about a potential killer on campus. Then, in February 2007, police announced an arrest. The suspect was a fellow student, 20-year-old Orange Taylor III. He lived in the same residence hall as Laura and was known around campus as quiet but unpredictable. Security footage from a night of the murder showed Taylor entering the building around 4 a.m. and leaving again at dawn. DNA recovered from the scene matched his. In his dorm room, police found pornographic material and items taken from Laura's room, a small camera and several personal belongings she had owned. Taylor initially denied knowing her, then later claimed he had entered her room while she was sleeping but didn't remember what happened. The trial, held in 2008, revealed a disturbing chain of failures. Administrators at Eastern Michigan University had known the autopsy results weeks before the arrest, but had withheld the information, continuing to assure students and parents that no foul play was involved. The university president and several senior officials were eventually fired for violating federal campus crime disclosure laws under the Clary Act. During testimony, jurors heard how Taylor had lingered in hallways late at night, sometimes entering unlocked rooms. On the night Laura was killed, he had been under the influence of alcohol and possibly other substances. His defense argued that the act was not premeditated, but the evidence, the positioning of the body, the removal of key items, and his own recorded statements painted a different picture. The prosecution described Laura Dickinson as attacked in the one place she should have felt safe. Taylor was convicted of first-degree murder, home invasion, and sexual assault. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. In the years since, Laura's case has remained part of university safety discussions across the U.S., often cited in criminology courses and campus security training. The building where she was killed, Hill Hall, was temporarily closed after the trial and later renovated. Her parents established a scholarship for music students in her name. They rarely spoke publicly after the sentencing, except to say they hoped their daughter's story would remind universities of the duty to protect students and tell the truth. Inside the Ypsilanti Police Department's archives, the case file is still there, a thick binder labeled Dickinson L. The first photo shows the closed dorm door, a piece of tape across the lock, sealing it for evidence. The next shows a small whiteboard hanging beside the door, in black marker, still faintly visible. Good night, everyone. See you tomorrow. Southampton, England, March 2003. It was a Friday night, and 17-year-old Hannah Foster was walking home from a night out with her friends in Southampton. She had just missed the last bus by a few minutes. It was after midnight, cold, and the streets were quiet. Hannah told her friends she'd be fine. It was only a short walk home, and she'd done it before. She never arrived. Hannah was last seen alive around 11:50 p.m. as she made her way down a dimly lit stretch of Hill Lane, a few hundred meters from her house. She spoke briefly on her mobile phone with a friend, saying everything was okay. Then, moments later, her phone went dead. The next morning, when Hannah hadn't returned home, her parents, Trevor and Hillary Foster, contacted police. At first, it was treated as a missing person case, but the tone shifted within hours. A signal from Hannah's mobile phone had been traced to the nearby area of Southampton Docks, an industrial zone far from where she'd been walking. 2 days later, her body was found in a ditch off Allington Lane, a rural area on the outskirts of the city. She had been raped and strangled. The investigation that followed became one of the largest in the region's history. CCTV footage captured a white van driving slowly near Hill Lane at the time Hannah disappeared. Witnesses reported seeing a man of South Asian descent behind the wheel. Police released the footage to the public, and within days, tips flooded in. One name kept surfacing: Maninder Pal Singh Kohli, a 34-year-old married father of two who worked as a delivery driver. When police arrived at his flat, Kohli was gone. He had fled the country days earlier, taking a flight to India. That escape began a 4-year international manhunt that would test the limits of British-Indian cooperation. In 2003, there was no formal extradition treaty between the two countries, and extradition from India to the UK had rarely been granted. Still, detectives refused to let the case fade. Meanwhile, the Foster family refused to stay silent. They launched a public campaign, Justice for Hannah, and traveled to India themselves in 2004, appearing on local television to plead for help finding their daughter's killer. Their appearance generated enormous media attention. Within weeks, tips from viewers led Indian police to a small town near Chandigarh, where Kohli was hiding under a false name. He was arrested after a brief chase. The British authorities filed for extradition, but Kohli fought it in court, claiming he would not receive a fair trial in the UK. The process dragged on for years, with Kohli repeatedly appealing to delay his return. During his time in Indian custody, he granted several press interviews, denying involvement, then later admitting he had picked her up but insisting her death was accidental. Finally, in 2007, after sustained pressure and diplomatic involvement, the Indian government approved his extradition. It was the first successful extradition from India to the UK in over a decade. At his trial in Winchester Crown Court in 2008, prosecutors presented DNA evidence linking Kohli to the crime. Traces of his DNA were found on Hannah's body and clothing. Phone records also placed him near the scene, and CCTV footage confirmed his van's presence in the area minutes before she vanished. Kohli's defense argued that the sex had been consensual, a claim the prosecution dismantled with forensic evidence showing clear signs of restraint and struggle. Witnesses described Kohli as having a history of aggression toward women. Former co-workers testified that he had once been suspended for inappropriate behavior toward a colleague. His wife told police she had suspected he was unfaithful, but had no idea what he was capable of. When the jury returned, they found Kohli guilty of rape and murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 24 years. In the courtroom, Hannah's father read a short statement. He thought he could run away and live a new life. But Hannah's voice followed him, even across the world. The case had an enormous impact on policing and victim advocacy. It led to new guidelines on how international extradition could be pursued in serious cases and inspired procedural reforms between UK and Indian authorities. But beyond the legal outcomes, what stayed with many was the image of Hannah's parents, standing on a crowded street in India, thousands of miles from home, handing out flyers with their daughter's face printed on them. The ditch where Hannah was found has long since grown over with grass. The white van was dismantled after the trial. But every year, in March, a small gathering takes place at the site. Friends, family, and a few police officers lay flowers and stand in silence for a few minutes. They don't speak about the trial or the extradition, or even about the long years of waiting. They just remember the walk home that should. New South Wales, Australia, June 1997. She told her family she was going overseas for a break. The next thing that remained was the memory of her name and a blank space where she once lived. Marion Barter was 51 years old in 1997, a schoolteacher, mother of two, living on Australia's Gold Coast. In March of that year, something changed. She resigned from her job, sold her house, and told friends she was going on sabbatical to Europe. Without much fanfare, she became secretive. In May, she legally changed her name to Florabella Natalia Marion Remakel. Then, on June 22, 1997, she vanished. That morning, Marion was dropped off at a Southport bus depot to catch a connection to the airport. She carried only a few items. She never arrived in England, or at least no credible evidence ever showed she did. Her family spent days waiting for postcards, phone calls, something, anything. Nothing came. Over the next months, she made brief contact by phone. On August 1st, she called her daughter from Tunbridge Wells, England, and spoke until the coins in the call box ran out. She said she missed her. That was the last confirmed conversation. When October came, her failure to call for her son's birthday alarmed the family. On October 15th, 1997, she was last accounted for in financial records. That day, 80,000 Australian dollars was transferred to an unknown account, reportedly at the behest of a man named Rick Blum, known to Marion as Fernand Remakel. Investigations later revealed that in August and September, thousands of dollars were withdrawn daily from Marion's accounts in Byron Bay and Burleigh Heads. Meanwhile, her daughter Sally Layden was informed that Marion had been reclassified by the NSW police as located and removed from Australia's missing persons register, a decision fraught with controversy and delay. For years, Marion Barter's disappearance was treated as a potential voluntary absence, a middle-aged woman choosing to disappear. Yet her behavior was unlike someone who simply wished to vanish. She cut ties too sharply, changed her name, manipulated her accounts, and maintained moments of contact in ways that defied a clean break. In 2019, after decades of public pressure and media attention, especially from the podcast The Lady Vanishes, the NSW authorities transferred her case to their unsolved homicide squad. The investigation shifted from missing person to suspected homicide. The turning point came in February 2024, when the NSW state coroner formally declared Marion Barter deceased, dating her death to sometime after October 15, 1997. However, the coroner made no finding on the place, cause, or manner of death. There simply was not enough admissible evidence. The inquest was scathing of past police failures and criticized the removal of Marion from the missing persons register. The coroner explicitly stated her belief that Rick Blum does indeed know more than he has disclosed. The evidence amassed over the years paints a haunting outline more than a portrait. Marion had traveled with Blum in England under his alias. She returned to Australia discreetly in August, yet her passport was never used afterward. She had instructed banking staff to allow large withdrawals, as if she were preparing to vanish, while leaving few tracks behind. During the inquest, 2 other women came forward claiming Blum had similarly manipulated them, offering new starts in foreign lands. The coroner found that Blum had a pattern of misrepresenting himself to women for financial gain. He had used multiple names, including Remakel, and had hidden his true marital status. Yet no charges were laid. Despite the passage of time, parts of Marion's life remained shards. The property she sold, her house stripped, the accounts emptied, the name she adopted, and the man who encouraged her. The evidentiary record is mosaic, fragments from bank ledgers, phone records, name change documents, witness statements, and gaps in investigative continuity. Today, detectives still consider the possibility that key evidence was lost forever. The coroner's inquest expressed concern that the early handling of the case, particularly between 1997 and 2007, led to the loss or contamination of vital material. The removal of Marion from the missing persons list further hindered follow-up. The coroner urged that the homicide squad maintain jurisdiction to allow new forensic techniques to be applied. Marion Barter's case is remembered now as one of Australia's most perplexing mysteries, a woman who arranged her exit with precision, leaving behind an echo of trust, betrayal, and unanswered questions. The inquest may have declared her dead, but it left open the who, how, and why. The envelope of the mystery remains sealed, awaiting a hand willing to unfold it. Harlan County, Kentucky, United States, 1930s. In a cabin deep in the coal mining country of Kentucky, a woman's voice once echoed across the dark hills, fierce, defiant, and unforgettable. Florence Reese wasn't famous for vanishing. She was famous for surviving. But before the songs and speeches, before her name became a symbol, there was a night when she did disappear. Not in the usual way, but in a way that left no one certain she'd make it out alive. Florence was born in 1900, the daughter of a poor coal miner. By the early 1930s, she was married to Sam Reese, a union organizer in Harlan County. Those were violent years, the bloody Harlan era, when miners were fighting to unionize and coal companies were responding with hired gunmen. Homes were raided, people were beaten, and entire families were driven from the county under threat of death. In the summer of 1931, the Reese family became targets. Late one night, while Sam was away, armed deputies stormed their house looking for him. They tore through drawers, ripped open bedding, smashed furniture, and pointed guns at Florence and her children. When they finally left, the family fled into the hills. For several days, no one knew where they were. Neighbors said they'd seen Florence running through the woods barefoot, carrying her youngest child. Others said she was hiding in a church basement outside Pineville. When she eventually returned, she had nothing but a few clothes and a scrap of paper on which she'd written a few lines. A song that would become known as Which Side Are You On? The story that followed is well known in American folk history. How that song spread across the country, sung by miners and protesters for decades. What's less remembered is the silence that followed the song's creation. How, after its first recording, Florence Reese seemed to fade from public view for years. By 1932, reports from Harlan County listed her husband as missing from the area. Sam Reese had been forced to flee Kentucky altogether, his name on a hit list drawn up by the mine operators. Florence, now living under assumed names, moved with her children between small towns in Tennessee and Georgia. For a while, even her extended family didn't know where she was. Letters from that period tell of nights spent sleeping in abandoned cabins and of constant fear that men from the company police were still searching. The union offices in Knoxville kept a file on her, a single sheet marked location unknown. The press, which had quoted her after the raid, stopped mentioning her name. For years, Florence Reese was simply gone. Not dead, not confirmed alive, just absent from any official record. The Kentucky newspapers that had once covered the Union struggle began to speak of her in the past tense, as if she had been another casualty of the labor war. When she reappeared in the early 1940s, living quietly near Knoxville, few recognized her. The face in the Union bulletins was older, harder. Her husband Sam was still in hiding, working under aliases in Tennessee and Virginia. She told friends that the years in between had burned everything out of her but the song. Historians would later debate where she'd gone and how she survived those missing years. Some claim she stayed with relatives in Pineville, others that she crossed into Ohio. The truth is fragmented, told mostly through second-hand recollections. What's certain is that Florence Reese's disappearance was not the kind that ends with a body or a police report. It was a vanishing into survival, a forced invisibility that left her cut off from her own past. When she returned to public life decades later, singing Which Side Are You On at union rallies, people treated her like a ghost come back to life, a living witness to something that had nearly destroyed her. Her voice trembled with age, but the song remained the same. She would die in 1986. In Knoxville, her brief disappearance largely forgotten, overshadowed by the legacy of her song. Yet among the miners who remembered the night of the raid, and the children who had seen her vanish into the hills, Florence Reese's name carried a different weight, not just that of defiance, but of something quieter and darker. For those few days in 1931, when her home was destroyed and her family scattered, Florence Reese truly had disappeared into the thick woods of Harlan County, into the smoke and fear of a time when survival required invisibility. She was never declared missing, never recorded in police files. But the gap remains there in history, unmarked, a silence where a song began. St. Andrews, Scotland, 1987. It was a cold November evening on the coast of Fife when 18-year-old Claire Morrison was last seen alive. The sea was calm, the streets almost empty, and St. Andrews, a small, historic university town, was settling into the early winter quiet. Claire had been out with friends, laughing and walking the familiar paths home. No one who saw her that night could have imagined that, within hours, she would be found dead on the sand. Claire Morrison was a first-year student at Dundee University, studying physiotherapy. She had grown up in Hilton of Cadboll, a small village in the Highlands, and had recently moved south to live near the university. She was quiet, thoughtful, and by all accounts, responsible. Not the kind of person who disappeared into the night without reason. On the night of November 10th, 1987, Claire had gone out to meet a friend in St. Andrews. Witnesses later said she left around 10:30 p.m., walking alone along Hepburn Gardens toward the West Sands beach, the same beach made famous by the opening scene of Chariots of Fire. The walk should have taken her 15 minutes. She never arrived home. The next morning, a local dog walker discovered a body near the waterline. The tide had gone out, leaving wet sand and scattered seaweed around the shape of a young woman lying face down. Her clothing was torn, her scarf was missing, and there were marks on her neck that suggested strangulation. Police sealed off the beach immediately. Forensic teams worked through the morning as the wind picked up, blowing sea spray across the cordoned area. They found footprints in the sand, one set belonging to Claire, and another larger, heavier pattern that appeared beside hers for several yards before vanishing toward the dunes. The attack had been violent, but controlled. There was no sign of panic or struggle beyond the immediate area of the body. Detectives believed she had been followed from town, assaulted, and killed in a matter of minutes. The investigation quickly drew national attention. St. Andrews wasn't known for violent crime. The idea that a young woman could be murdered on a public beach so close to student housing was deeply unsettling. Dozens of officers were brought in. They interviewed everyone who had seen her that night: students, local residents, taxi drivers, shopkeepers. Descriptions varied. Some said they'd seen a man loitering near the path by Hepburn Gardens, tall, wearing a dark coat. Others mentioned a car idling near the golf course road, headlights off. The accounts conflicted, and without cameras or reliable lighting, it was difficult to confirm anything. For weeks, police searched the surrounding dunes and woodland. They found fragments of clothing, but nothing definitive. Claire's missing scarf, which had been handmade by her mother, was never recovered. The murder weapon was never found either. Pathologists concluded she had likely been strangled manually. No rope, no ligature. Whoever killed her had done it with their hands. By December, detectives had a list of suspects, all men who had been in the area that night, but none of them fit cleanly. Some were students, others were locals with minor offenses. Each was questioned, released, and cleared. Then, in early 1988, a name surfaced that would shadow the case for decades: Brian Buchanan, a 23-year-old soldier stationed at Lutcher's Air Base, just a few miles from St. Andrews. He had been in town the night of the murder and was known to walk along the beach late at night. Police questioned him, but found no physical evidence linking him to Claire's death. DNA testing was still in its infancy, and what samples they had were too degraded by seawater to be useful. For years, the case remained open. The beach where Claire was found returned to quiet normality. Joggers in the morning, students at sunset, but the story never quite left the town. Residents spoke of it in lowered voices, a reminder of how quickly the familiar could turn strange. In 2004, forensic technology had advanced enough for investigators to re-examine what little material evidence remained. Traces of male DNA were recovered from Claire's clothing. It was partial, incomplete, but enough to rule out several early suspects. Then, in 2005, police announced that Brian Buchanan, by then living abroad, had been arrested in connection with the murder after a DNA match linked him to the case. He was extradited to Scotland and charged with Claire Morrison's killing. The trial, held in 2006, was tense and widely covered in the press. Prosecutors presented the DNA evidence as proof that Buchanan had been with Claire the night she died. The defense countered that the sample was too weak to be conclusive, contaminated after years of storage. Witnesses were called: old friends, police officers, pathologists, each recalling details that had blurred over time. The jury deliberated for days. In the end, the verdict was not proven, a uniquely Scottish decision meaning that guilt had not been established beyond doubt, but neither had innocence. Buchanan walked free. The decision left Claire's family devastated. Her mother, Elizabeth, said quietly to reporters outside the court that she still believed the right man had been in the dock, but justice never came. Since then, no one else has been charged. The case remains technically open, revisited every few years when technology improves. Investigators continue to store what remains of the evidence in controlled conditions, hoping that one day, a more complete DNA profile might finally identify the killer. Locals still speak of West Sands with unease. On certain evenings, when the tide is low, the beach looks almost the same as it did in the photographs from 1987. The same stretch of wet sand, the same path leading back toward the town. Students who move to St. Andrews often hear the story told in pieces, over drinks or whispered walks home. The details are always slightly different. The color of her scarf, the way she was found, whether the killer was ever caught. But the image stays the same. A young woman walking home alone under the cold Scottish sky, footsteps fading into the sand beside strangers. And in the official record, her name remains attached to a single word, unsolved. Formentera, Spain, 2015. On the afternoon of August 2nd, 2015, the surface of the Mediterranean Sea was still and blue beneath the Spanish sun. A small group of divers floated just off the coast of Formentera, a quiet island south of Ibiza, known for its clear waters and hidden coves. Among them was a woman who, to anyone familiar with the sport, needed no introduction. Natalia Molchanova, the most accomplished free diver in the world. She was 53 years old, a former swimming coach who had become a legend in a field that tested the human body to its limit. Over her career, she had set 41 world records and won 23 world championships, diving to depths few believed were humanly possible, often over 100 meters on a single breath. That day's dive wasn't part of a competition. It was supposed to be recreational, a casual descent around 30 to 40 meters with a few friends from the local diving community. They met near the coast, loaded their gear onto a small boat, and motored out toward deeper water. The sun was bright, the sea calm. No one felt uneasy. Shortly before 1 p.m., Natalia adjusted her mask, took a long, slow breath, and slipped beneath the surface. The other divers watched her descent. The smooth, practiced motion of a woman who had done this thousands of times before. Then, the sea swallowed her, and she vanished into the blue. When the agreed dive time passed, and she hadn't resurfaced, her friends began to scan the water. At first, they assumed she'd simply stayed down longer than planned. But after several more minutes, concern turned to alarm. They began diving in pairs, following her descent line, calling for assistance on the radio. There was no trace. Within an hour, local authorities were alerted. Helicopters from Ibiza joined rescue boats, sweeping the waters between Formentera and La Mola. By nightfall, dozens of divers were searching in coordinated patterns. They found nothing, no body, no equipment, no visible sign of struggle. The news spread quickly. Natalia Molchanova wasn't just any diver. She was the free diver, a figure whose name was synonymous with control, discipline, and the edge between life and death. For the global diving community, the idea that she could simply vanish in calm, shallow water was almost unthinkable. Investigators pieced together what they could. The sea that day had been deceptively gentle on the surface, but unpredictable below. Currents around Formentera can shift rapidly, forming invisible whirlpools that pull divers off course. Even an expert like Molchanova, without the security of a safety line or team, could have been swept into deeper water in seconds. There was another theory, that she had suffered shallow water blackout, a sudden loss of consciousness caused by oxygen depletion on ascent. It's a known risk even among the best freedivers. But it would have been rare for someone of her experience, especially on a casual, shallow dive. On the second day of searching, divers extended the perimeter to over 30 square miles. By the third, it reached 60. The water temperature dropped, the current strengthened, and visibility fell. After 4 days, the official search was suspended. Her son, Alexei Molchanov, himself a world champion diver, continued privately for several weeks. He told reporters that he believed she had been carried away by the current and would stay in the sea where she belonged. That line, quiet, almost reverent, became the closest thing to a conclusion. There was no funeral, Only a memorial dive held off the coast of Ibiza, where dozens of free divers descended in unison, letting white flowers drift toward the depths. For months afterward, sightings and rumors persisted. A body floating near the Balearic Trench, a diver's fin washed ashore. None were confirmed. The Mediterranean had swallowed her completely. In the years since, Natalia Molchanova's disappearance has taken on a strange dual legacy. To free divers, she is a figure of almost mythic respect, someone who mastered breadth and depth until the ocean claimed her. To investigators, her case remains a cautionary mystery, a disappearance with no evidence, no clear cause, and no recovery. Her last known dive profile, recorded on a friend's watch, shows a smooth descent to just over 35 meters, then a steady ascent, and then a sudden loss of trace. Those who knew her say that if anyone could find peace in that silence, it was Natalia. She had once said that free diving felt like coming home, a place where the noise of the world disappeared. Today, divers still visit the site off Formentera where she was last seen. The currents there move unpredictably, calm one minute, rippling and dark the next. The seafloor drops sharply beyond the reef, into depths that fade into darkness. Some who dive there describe a strange stillness, as if the water itself remembers. No wreck, no weight belt, no trace of air remains. Just the record of a perfect descent and the name of a woman who never resurfaced. Trentino Alto, Adige, Italy, 2020. On a cold January morning in 2020, the small town of Appiano, in northern Italy's Trentino Alto Adige region, woke to the sound of search helicopters circling the hills. A 21-year-old woman named Francesca Onobile had vanished without trace. Francesca was known to everyone in the town, a quiet, kind young woman who worked part-time and lived with her parents. She had recently started a new job at a local factory and was described by her co-workers as polite, diligent, and dependable. Nothing about her life suggested the kind of chaos or danger that usually precedes a disappearance. On the morning of January 9th, 2020, Francesca left her home at around 7 a.m. She was wearing her work uniform and carrying her phone. She told her parents she was heading to work as usual, but she never arrived. When she failed to show up, her employer called her family to ask if she was ill. Her phone went straight to voicemail. By afternoon, concern turned to panic. Her parents contacted the local carabinieri, who began what would become one of the most baffling missing person investigations in northern Italy in recent memory. The first clue came quickly: her phone signal. Cell tower data showed her last known location was in the Adige Valley, a steep, forested region near the small village of Corniano, less than 10 kilometers from her home. It was a strange direction to be heading on foot, especially that early in the morning. Search teams, including trained dogs and drones, scoured the area. They found no signs of a struggle, no footprints, no dropped belongings. Snow had fallen lightly overnight, making it harder to track anything meaningful. By the second day, the operation had expanded across nearby vineyards and forest paths. Helicopters equipped with heat cameras swept the valley, while divers searched local rivers and ponds. The weather turned colder, dipping below freezing. Then, the case took a strange turn. A hiker reported seeing a young woman matching Francesca's description near Lake Caldaro, about 8 kilometers south, around 8 a.m. that morning. The same time she should have been at work. The witness claimed she looked confused or in distress, standing near the edge of the frozen water, staring out. When he approached, she walked away toward the trees. Search teams moved quickly to the lake. The ice was thin in places, with dark patches suggesting meltwater below. For several days, divers operated in dangerous conditions, breaking through the ice to check beneath. But they found nothing. Rumors began to spread through the town. Some believed Francesca had suffered a mental health crisis and wandered into the wilderness. Others whispered about foul play, that she might have met someone that morning, possibly someone she knew. Investigators examined her phone records, social media, and recent messages. Nothing pointed to a meeting or argument. Her last text, sent to a coworker the night before, was completely ordinary. See you tomorrow. Weeks passed. Posters went up in every nearby village. Her parents gave tearful interviews, pleading for information. Volunteers combed the area almost daily, but there were no leads, no new sightings. Then, 2 months later, in March 2020, the search came to a quiet, grim end. A group of fishermen on the southern edge of Lake Caldaro spotted something in the water, caught against the reeds. When rescuers arrived, they confirmed what everyone had feared. It was Francesca Onobile. Her body had been submerged under the ice for weeks, likely since the morning she disappeared. The condition of the remains made it impossible to determine a precise time of death, but her belongings were still intact. Her phone, her ID, and her wallet. There were no signs of violence or struggle. Investigators concluded that Francesca had likely fallen through the ice accidentally. Perhaps she had walked onto the frozen surface, disoriented, or simply unaware of the danger. But even that explanation raised questions. Why would she have been there at all, miles away from her route to work, in freezing weather, without telling anyone? Her family insisted she had no reason to go to the lake and no history of depression or wandering. The case was officially closed as a tragic accident, but many locals remain unconvinced. Theories persist that she might have been meeting someone or that she was followed. Others point to the isolated lakeside road, where several previous disappearances had occurred over the years, some still unsolved. Today, the area around Lake Caldaro is quiet again. Tourists visit in the summer to swim and kayak, unaware that beneath its calm surface lies a story that has never quite made sense. Every January, locals leave white flowers at the northern shore, where Francesca was last seen. Her family still lives in Appiano, and they continue to question what really happened that morning. A girl leaves home for work in a quiet alpine town, and an hour later, she's gone, swallowed by the cold water of a lake she never planned to visit. A simple walk to work that somehow ended in silence. London, United Kingdom, 1888. It was just past dawn on September 8th, 1888, when John Davis, a resident of 29 Hanbury Street in London's East End, stepped into the narrow backyard behind his building. What he found there would haunt the city for generations. A woman's mutilated body lay sprawled on the cold cobblestones, her throat cut so deeply it nearly severed her head. Her abdomen had been savagely opened, and parts of her internal organs were missing. The victim's name was Annie Chapman, and her murder would soon become one of the central chapters in the legend of Jack the Ripper. Annie Chapman was 47 years old, a mother of 3, and known among her friends in Spitalfields as Dark Annie. Life had not been kind to her. Once married to a respectable coachman named John Chapman, she had lived a comfortable working-class life in Windsor. But after the death of one of their children and the growing strain of alcoholism, the couple separated. Annie moved to London, living hand-to-mouth in the teeming streets of Whitechapel, a district marked by poverty, overcrowding, and despair. By 1888, she was homeless, earning money by selling crochet work and occasionally turning to sex work when desperate. She often stayed in common lodging houses, paying a few pennies for a bed each night. On the evening of Friday, September 7th, witnesses said she had been drinking, but not excessively. She was turned away from her usual lodging house at 35 Dorset Street after failing to pay the fee of 4p. Her final words to the deputy keeper were eerily ordinary. "I'll soon be back. I gotta go and get my DOS money." At around 5:30 a.m. the next morning, a woman named Elizabeth Long was walking down Hanbury Street when she saw Annie standing outside number 29, speaking to a man. The man was of average build, wearing a dark overcoat and a deerstalker hat, a description that would later echo through police reports. Long overheard the man say, "Will you?" To which Annie softly replied, "Yes." It would be the last conversation she ever had. Just 30 minutes later, residents inside the house reported hearing a soft thump against the wooden fence in the backyard, a sound so ordinary that no one thought to check. When John Davis stepped out into the yard at 6 a.m., the horror of what had happened became clear. Annie's body was lying between the steps and the fence, her head tilted toward the house, her legs drawn up. Her face was pale, and her eyes stared lifelessly at the morning sky. Her throat had been cut twice, and her abdomen had been grotesquely mutilated. The killer had taken a portion of her uterus, suggesting a deliberate and anatomical removal. The local police quickly called for the newly formed Metropolitan Police H Division, and Inspector Joseph Chandler arrived at the scene. He was soon joined by Dr. George Bagster Phillips, the divisional police surgeon, who determined that Annie had been dead for less than 30 minutes, meaning her killer had escaped just minutes before the body was found. The brutality of the crime shocked even hardened detectives. The precision of the cuts suggested that the murderer had some knowledge of anatomy or butchery, leading to speculation that he might be a surgeon, a medical student, or slaughterhouse worker. Dr. Phillips estimated that the killer must have carried out the mutilation swiftly in less than 15 minutes under the dim light of early dawn. Annie's personal belongings were found neatly arranged beside her body: a comb, a piece of muslin, 2 farthings, and a small leather purse. But more curious was a scrap of envelope near her feet bearing the partial address, SP Spitalfields. Some speculated that it could have been dropped by the killer himself. News of the murder spread rapidly across London, following on the heels of the killing of Marion Nichols just 1 week earlier. The press began to connect the two crimes, both marked by throat slashing and abdominal mutilation. The name Jack the Ripper had not yet appeared in the newspapers, but the people of Whitechapel already whispered of a phantom figure haunting their streets. In the days following Annie's murder, police interviewed dozens of witnesses. Some claimed to have seen a suspicious man loitering near Hanbury Street earlier that morning, described variously as wearing a dark coat, a low cap, or even a felt hat. But none of the sightings could be confirmed. Dr. Phillips's post-mortem revealed the full horror of the act. The killer had removed the uterus with clean precision, using a knife at least 6 to 8 inches long, sharp and thin. The operation, though hurried, showed control and purpose, not random rage. It must have been someone who knew exactly where to cut, Phillips told investigators. Despite the intense investigation, no suspect was ever charged. Several names emerged, from John Pizer, a local bootmaker nicknamed Leather Apron, to George Chapman, a barber later convicted of poisoning his wives. But in 1888, none could be tied definitively to Annie's death. The murder of Annie Chapman cemented the growing belief that a single killer was responsible for a string of escalating atrocities. Within weeks, 2 more victims, Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, would follow, their murders even more violent and ritualistic. By the time Mary Jane Kelly was killed that November, the press had fully adopted the moniker Jack the Ripper, a name derived from a letter sent to authorities claiming authorship of the killings. Annie's funeral took place quietly at Manor Park Cemetery on September 14th, attended only by a few relatives and mourners. She was buried in an unmarked grave, later lost beneath layers of new burials. More than a century later, historians, criminologists, and amateur sleuths still study her case, hoping to uncover who really stood with her that morning on Hanbury Street. Was he a local butcher, a deranged surgeon, or the faceless figure who vanished forever into the fog of Victorian London? Annie Chapman's death transformed a series of isolated crimes into a full-blown nightmare, one that defined the myth of Jack the Ripper and ensured her name would never be forgotten. Chelmsford, United Kingdom, 2008. On the surface, Maria Stubbings led a quiet, ordinary life. She was 50 years old, a devoted mother, and known by her neighbors in Chelmsford, Essex, as warm and open-hearted. But in December 2008, Maria vanished from her home without a trace. What began as a missing persons case quickly revealed itself to be something darker, a failure of the very systems meant to protect her. Maria had lived through violence before. In 2007, she met Mark Chivers, a man recently returned to the UK after serving time in Germany for murdering his former girlfriend. He had strangled her with a belt during an argument, served his sentence, and then been deported back to Britain. Despite this history, Chivers was free unmonitored, and soon found his way into Maria's life. At first, their relationship seemed ordinary, even affectionate. Friends recalled how Maria, a kind woman who often saw the best in people, believed Chivers had changed. He was charming when he wanted to be, quick to make her laugh, and persuasive in his apologies. But beneath that surface calm was volatility, and Maria began to sense it. By early 2008, the relationship had turned controlling. Chivers followed her, checked her phone, and called constantly. Maria reported him to police several times for harassment. In March that year, officers arrested him for assaulting her. He had allegedly grabbed her by the throat. He was convicted and served 6 months in prison. Maria tried to rebuild her life while he was behind bars. But when Chivers was released in the autumn of 2008, he returned to Chelmsford and soon began contacting her again. Despite her fear, she was drawn back into conversation with him, perhaps out of empathy, perhaps exhaustion. On December 11th, Maria contacted police again. Chivers had been at her home and was becoming threatening. Officers visited and reportedly told her they would keep an eye on him, but no immediate action was taken. The next day, December 12th, Maria's daughter, Celeste, tried calling her mother, but received no reply. The phone rang and rang, unanswered. Over the next few days, messages went unreturned, and Maria's friend began to worry. By December 14th, they reported her missing. Police conducted a welfare check at her home on Springfield Road, but officers left after getting no response at the door. They didn't force entry. It wasn't until December 19th, a full week after her disappearance, that police entered the house. They found Maria's body hidden in the downstairs bathroom, covered with a pile of clothes and towels. She had been strangled with a dog lead. Mark Chivers was arrested that same day. He was found at his new girlfriend's home just a few miles away. When questioned, he admitted to killing Maria, but claimed it was not premeditated. He told detectives that he had gone to see her. They argued, and things got out of hand. The reality was far colder. Investigators determined that Chivers had killed Maria sometime between December 11th and 12th, within hours of her last police contact. After the murder, he had stayed in the area, using her phone to send misleading text messages suggesting she was still alive. He even called one of her friends pretending to be concerned about her disappearance. When the full timeline became public, outrage followed. It emerged that Essex police had failed to act on multiple warnings, not only from Maria, but also from probation services aware of Chivers' past. Officers had not conducted a risk assessment despite knowing he was a convicted murderer, nor had they forced entry during the welfare check, despite clear cause for concern. An inquest later described Maria's death as preventable. The Independent Police Complaint Commission found serious failings in how Essex police handled her reports of abuse. The officer who dealt with her final call had not checked Chivers' record or the domestic violence warnings attached to his name. During Chivers' trial at Chelmsford Crown Court in 2009, prosecutors described a chilling pattern: a man who killed women who rejected him. The court heard that both murders, in Germany and in Essex, followed arguments where he lost control and strangled his partner. The judge called him dangerous beyond redemption. Chivers was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 27 years. The public inquiry that followed Maria's death led to renewed scrutiny of domestic violence response procedures across the UK. Her case was cited in parliamentary debates and policy reforms, alongside other high-profile failures where women were killed by men previously reported to police. Neighbors who remembered Maria said her home stayed dark for months after the crime. Friends gathered, sometimes outside, leaving flowers and notes by the garden gate. She did everything she was supposed to, one friend said years later. She called for help. They just didn't listen. What remained most unsettling was how easily it could have been stopped. Chivers was a known killer, on record for murder, and Maria had reported his escalating violence more than once. Yet the system treated him like any other suspect, a bureaucratic error that cost her life. For those who knew her, the story of Maria Stubbings became less about mystery and more about a stark failure of protection. A woman whose kindness met something brutal, and whose death exposed how fragile safety can be when warnings go unheard. On a cold morning in March 1993, a pale mist settled over the rural outskirts of Lyon. The village was small, framed by fields and silent roads where little happened that wasn't noticed. That morning, a single car sat abandoned by the side of the D42, its driver's door ajar, the key still in the ignition. It belonged to a 34-year-old woman named Madeline Dassaw. She was last seen leaving her home just after dawn. According to her husband, she was heading toward Lyon to meet a client. She worked as a notary's assistant, organized, punctual, and known for her calm manner. She wore a dark blue coat, a simple silk scarf, and carried a brown leather bag with neatly arranged documents inside. When she failed to arrive at her appointment and didn't answer her phone, her colleagues assumed traffic delays. By the time her car was found, 7 hours had passed. The Renault 5 was pulled slightly off the road, as if parked in a hurry. Inside, investigators found her handbag on the passenger seat, still zipped. Her identification papers and wallet were untouched. The driver's seat was adjusted forward, her usual position. The car keys dangled from the ignition. Nothing suggested a struggle. At first, police believed she might have wandered off, an accident, perhaps, or a sudden illness. A search was organized across the fields nearby, extending into the sparse woodland east of the road. Dogs traced her scent a few hundred meters before it vanished near a shallow ditch. No footprints were visible. The ground was hard, frost-bitten. Neighbors described seeing her car that morning, parked exactly where it was found, between 7 and 8 o'clock. A delivery driver claimed he noticed a second vehicle behind it, a white Peugeot van, but he couldn't recall the license plate. No one saw Madeline herself. Her husband, Gerard Dassaw, reported her missing just after midday. He seemed composed when police arrived, though his answers were brief. He told them they had argued the previous night about finances, but insisted she left home calm, as usual. Detectives noted the absence of emotion in his tone, but found no immediate cause for suspicion. By evening, helicopters scanned the fields, their lights cutting through the fog. Volunteers moved in slow lines across the farmland, calling her name. Nothing was found. No clothing, no footprints, no trace of a body. In the following days, the case grew stranger. Bank records showed no withdrawals, no credit activity, and her passport remained at home. Her phone records ended at 7:16 a.m. when she received a call from an unknown number lasting 12 seconds. The number led nowhere. It was traced to a prepaid card purchased at a kiosk in Lyon 2 days earlier. Police extended the search radius to nearby villages. Canvassing teams asked residents whether anyone had seen a woman matching her description hitchhiking, walking, or in distress. A farmer recalled seeing someone who might have been her near the old railway bridge at about 8:30 that morning. The sighting couldn't be confirmed. Within a week, investigators began to consider foul play. Her disappearance bore none of the hallmarks of voluntary departure. No packed bag, no signs of withdrawal from her routine life. There was no evidence of mental distress, no notes, no debts large enough to suggest escape. Attention turned again to Gerard. He maintained that he spent that morning at his factory job and had clocked in at 6:58 a.m. Surveillance confirmed this, though colleagues mentioned he left briefly around 8:15 to pick up something and returned 20 minutes later. When questioned, he said he had driven to a nearby bakery. Receipts supported the claim, though the bakery's owner didn't recall seeing him. Forensic teams examined the car in detail. On the passenger side door, they found a faint smudge, possibly a handprint, but too blurred for identification. A few strands of hair were recovered from the back seat, none belonging to Madeline. The hairs were later matched to an unidentified female, possibly transferred incidentally, but their origin was never confirmed. Weeks passed. The story faded from the national press, overshadowed by larger events. But in Lyon, posters with her photograph remained on notice boards and shop windows. Despero, Madeline Dassaw, 34 ANS. In June, a fisherman discovered a woman's scarf caught in the reeds along the Rhone, 30 kilometers from where her car was found. The pattern matched one owned by Madeline. It was clean, undamaged, and likely placed there by water flow. No other evidence accompanied it. The area was searched again, divers sweeping the murky river, but nothing surfaced. Her family continued to insist she wouldn't have vanished willingly. They described her as meticulous, the type to set out her clothes for the next day and leave notes for even the smallest errands. Her absence left no such order, no sign of preparation. By late summer, detectives began reviewing similar cases across France. Missing women found near rural roads, often in daylight. Two cases from 1991 and 1992 shared partial similarities. Women traveling alone, vehicles discovered unlocked, no trace of struggle. None were conclusively linked, but investigators began to consider the possibility of a serial offender operating along secondary routes between Lyon and Saint-Étienne. In September 1993, a truck driver came forward claiming to have picked up a woman that morning near Villefranche-sur-Saône, around 40 kilometers north of the discovery site. She was disoriented, he said, quiet, and wearing a dark coat. When he stopped at a service area, she disappeared into the restroom and didn't return. The driver couldn't be sure of her identity, and the description, though similar, couldn't be verified. By winter, the case was officially labeled disparition inquiétante, an alarming disappearance. The active investigation dwindled. Files were archived, interviews logged, but no suspects were charged. 10 years later, in 2003, a construction crew working near St. Priest unearthed fragments of human bone during a drainage project. Forensic testing revealed they belonged to a woman aged 30 to 40, but the remains were incomplete, eroded by time and soil. A comparison to Madeline's dental records proved inconclusive due to the condition of the jawbone. The bones were preserved, cataloged, and stored in Lyon's forensic archive. In 2012, advances in DNA technology led investigators to reopen the sample for comparison with surviving family members. The results were partial, mitochondrial DNA consistent with Madeline's maternal line, but not sufficient for formal identification. Her disappearance remains open in the French National Database of Missing Persons, case number 93-0471-LY. Each year, the local paper republishes a small notice on the anniversary of her disappearance. It's brief, her name, age, and a black and white photo of her smiling faintly at the camera, her hair caught by wind. The Renault 5, long since returned to her husband, sat unused for years in a barn before being sold for scrap. The spot where it was found is still recognizable, a curve in the road, bordered by plane trees. There are no flowers or memorials, only a faint indentation in the gravel where cars still pull over sometimes, engine running before continuing on. United States, 1985. It was just after sunrise in Austin, Texas on October 13th, 1985 when a neighbor heard the sound. Not loud, but strange enough to make her pause. It came from apartment 119 at the Baywood complex on Barton Hills Drive. A rhythmic thudding, then silence. Minutes later, the neighbor called the police. When officers arrived, the apartment door was unlocked. Inside, the smell of iron and cleaning solution hung in the air. On the living room floor, near the couch, lay Natalie Antonetti, 38 years old. She was still breathing, but barely. Blood matted her dark hair, pooling beneath her head. Beside her was a wooden club, its end splintered, darkened. There were no signs of forced entry, no overturned furniture, no evidence of theft. She was taken to Brackenridge Hospital and placed on life support. Doctors found multiple skull fractures, blunt force trauma consistent with a single, focused attack. She never regained consciousness. After 3 days, her family made the decision to remove life support. Natalie was a mother of 2. Her son, Brandon, was 12 at the time. He had spent that night at a friend's house. When police questioned him, he said his mother had been fine the evening before, tired but in good spirits. She'd recently ended a difficult relationship and was focusing on work, friends, and her kids. Nothing seemed out of place. Detectives from the Austin Police Department began the investigation with what little they had: a bloodied weapon, no fingerprints, no witnesses. The apartment showed no sign of forced entry, suggesting Natalie either knew her attacker or had let them in willingly. In the days following the murder, police canvassed the apartment complex. Residents described Natalie as friendly, quiet, independent. One neighbor recalled seeing a man near her door around midnight, tall, dark-haired, pacing. Others reported hearing raised voices in the early hours, but no one saw the attack. Natalie's ex-boyfriend, Ray, became the immediate focus. They had dated on and off, a turbulent relationship marked by breakups and reconciliations. Witnesses said she had recently ended things for good. When questioned, he denied involvement, claiming he had been home alone. He agreed to a polygraph test and passed. Without evidence, police could not hold him. The case stalled. Months became years. Detectives rotated. New leads went nowhere. The wooden club, later confirmed to be part of a bedpost, yielded no usable prints. DNA testing in 1985 was rudimentary, and no samples were preserved well enough for later analysis. By the 1990s, the file was shelved among the city's growing collection of unsolved homicides. For Natalie's family, the absence of resolution became its own kind of haunting. Brandon grew up carrying that silence, the image of flashing lights outside their old apartment, the officers speaking in low tones. He became a musician, channeling much of that loss into his work. Still, the case remained officially cold. In 2007, the Austin Police Department launched a cold case review program, using modern DNA testing and database cross-referencing to re-examine old evidence. Natalie's file resurfaced. Detectives reviewed photos, reports, and lab records, trying to find anything overlooked. One name reappeared: Dennis Davis, a man who had dated Natalie briefly years before her death. At the time, Davis had an alibi supported by a friend, though inconsistencies were noted. He'd also been questioned in another assault case, but charges were dropped. The new detectives found that Davis still lived in Texas and had prior convictions for violent offenses, including one involving blunt force injury. They pulled the original evidence: the club, blood samples, fragments of hair recovered from the scene. The DNA was too degraded to yield a full profile, but trace material matched Davis's genetic markers through partial testing. It wasn't enough for conviction, but it reopened the file formally. Detectives interviewed Davis again in 2008. He denied knowing anything new, claiming he hadn't seen Natalie in years before her death. When asked about his alibi, he repeated the same story. He had been drinking with friends, went home, slept. But records showed no one corroborated his whereabouts after midnight. Brandon Antonetti, now an adult, began attending court hearings and public sessions related to cold case funding. He pushed for renewed attention on his mother's case. His persistence kept the story alive in local news segments. Then, in 2009, the Texas Department of Public Safety retested the original samples using newer mitochondrial DNA methods. The results didn't provide a full genetic match. Too much material had degraded, but did not exclude Davis. That, combined with circumstantial evidence and witness inconsistencies, led to his arrest in 2011, 26 years after the murder. The trial was deliberate, built mostly on pattern and proximity. Prosecutors argued that Davis had been obsessed with Natalie, that she had broken things off, and that he had come to her apartment that night. They suggested he used a piece of furniture from her own bedroom, the bedpost, to attack her after an argument. The defense countered that there was no conclusive DNA, no fingerprints, no direct proof. Jurors deliberated for 2 days before convicting Dennis Davis of murder in 2013. He was sentenced to life in prison. Even with a conviction, questions lingered. The evidence was circumstantial, the DNA partial. Some observers believe the verdict reflected more the need for closure than certainty. Appeals followed, and in 2017, a Texas appellate court overturned the conviction, citing insufficient direct evidence and errors in trial testimony. Davis was released, maintaining his innocence. The ruling left the case legally unresolved once again, not acquitted but not closed. Today, the file remains active in Austin's cold case database. The apartment complex where the murder occurred still stands, though the numbering has changed. The original living room was remodeled long ago, its walls repainted, flooring replaced. Nothing visible remains of that morning. In the records, her name appears alongside hundreds of others. Natalie Antonetti, 38, bludgeoned, 1985, Austin, Texas. Cause of death, blunt force trauma. Status, unsolved. Her son continues to perform under the name Brandon Allen, occasionally speaking about her case in interviews. He says the hardest part isn't the mystery itself, but the quiet, the way decades can pass and the truth can stay hidden in plain view, somewhere between paperwork, memory, and time. On cool mornings in Austin, the kind that feel almost the same as that October day in 1985, the neighborhood is quiet. Cars pass slowly along Barton Hills Drive, their tires whispering against the pavement. Apartment 119 no longer exists by that number, but if you walk the path between the buildings, you can still feel the layout. The window facing east, the narrow walkway, the stillness that holds after an echo fades. United States, 1980. The photograph shows a girl with long brown hair, smiling in that way teenagers do when they're caught between childhood and something harder. Her name was Carol and Cole, and in the winter of 1980, she vanished somewhere between Texas and Louisiana. For decades, no one knew where she'd gone, or that she had already been found. Carol was born in Kalamazoo, Michigan, but she grew up mostly in Texas. At 17, she was restless, a little uncertain, like most girls her age. Her parents were divorced, and she'd been living in a youth home in San Antonio, trying to start over. Letters she wrote from there were full of small details. Movies she'd seen, the meals they served, how she missed her sister. Her last known letter, dated December 1979, ended abruptly. "I'll call you soon. I think I might come home." She never did. In January 1980, she left the youth home with a friend. She was planning to travel to Shreveport, Louisiana, possibly to stay with acquaintances. No one knows if she ever made it. Weeks passed before anyone realized she was missing. Communication between shelters and social services was slow, and because she was nearly 18, her absence didn't immediately trigger an alarm. Her mother filed a missing person report that spring, describing her as 5'5", 110 pounds, last seen wearing jeans and a brown jacket. The report circulated quietly through police networks, but without a clear destination or witnesses, there was nowhere to start. 3 months later, on March 5, 1981, about 300 miles away, two men were hunting near a logging road in Bossier Parish, Louisiana. The area was thick with pine and red clay, isolated except for the occasional truck route. They noticed something strange near a tree line, a pile of ashes, darkened soil, and the faint outline of what appeared to be human remains. Sheriff's deputies arrived that afternoon. What they found was grim. The remains were skeletal, partially burned, scattered over an area no larger than a few meters. A small cross-shaped pendant lay nearby. No clothing survived. There were no teeth, no fingerprints, no ID. The only thing clear was that the body belonged to a young woman. Without identification, the case was labeled simply Bossier Doe. Detectives believed she had been dead for several weeks, possibly longer. Cause of death couldn't be determined. Theories ranged from homicide to accidental fire, but the presence of charring around the bones suggested deliberate burning. The site was remote. Whoever brought her there had intended her not to be found. They created a facial reconstruction, a soft clay model based on the skull. Photographs of it circulated through local newspapers, and missing persons bulletins were compared. But in 1981, Louisiana and Texas police systems weren't integrated. Information moved by fax, letter, or phone. The name Carol Cole never crossed a desk in Bossier Parish. The remains were buried in a cemetery under a small marker that read only Jane Doe, found 1981. For years, that was where the story ended. Carol's family kept searching. Her sister Linda called police stations, wrote letters, even hired private investigators. Every few years, a new lead would appear. A rumor, a girl resembling Carol seen in another state. But each time it fell apart. By the early 1990s, her mother had stopped calling. She still kept Carol's high school photo framed by her bedside. In 2005, advances in DNA profiling led to renewed interest in cold cases. A volunteer organization called the Doe Network began compiling missing persons and unidentified victim records online, encouraging families to submit DNA for comparison. That same year, a user uploaded details of the Bossier Doe case. Age, height estimate, found burned, 1981. It caught the attention of internet sleuths, but nothing matched. Then, in 2014, a retired law enforcement officer named Clyde Stewart revisited the Bossier case file. He was struck by the cross pendant, small, silver, with a pattern of dots engraved along its edge. He noted that in one of Carol's old photographs, she wore something similar. He contacted the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, NMUS, to check for matches between missing teenage girls from Texas and unidentified remains in Louisiana. That connection took months to process. Meanwhile, Carol's family, who had long moved away, began hearing rumors online that a Jane Doe found decades ago might be her. They submitted DNA samples through the Louisiana State Police Crime Lab. In February 2015, the results came back, a positive match. After 34 years, Bossier Doe finally had a name, Carol and Cole. When the announcement came, local news crews filmed the cemetery as a new headstone was placed beside the old one. The inscription read, "Finally home." Investigators reopened the case as a homicide. The identification, however, didn't solve the mystery, it deepened it. Police reconstructed her final known movements. Witnesses from a youth home remembered Carol leaving around Christmas 1979 with another girl, heading toward Shreveport. That second girl was never located. A few people recalled seeing Carol around the area in early 1980, possibly staying at a church shelter. One woman, who worked at a Christian youth home in the region, believed Carol had stayed there briefly before disappearing again. No records survived to confirm it. The location where her body was found, on land accessible by a single dirt road, suggested she knew or trusted the person who brought her there. The burn pattern indicated the fire was set after death, likely to destroy evidence. In interviews decades later, retired deputies described how limited resources were at the time. No DNA testing, no centralized database, few forensic tools. They kept her dental chart in a paper file and sent copies to Texas by mail. The results were lost. Even with identification, the case has no named suspect. The time gap, 34 years, erased much of what could have been proven. Witnesses aged or died. Records disappeared. The youth home closed in the 1980s. Its files were destroyed in a flood. Still, small details emerged over time. A man who worked in the area recalled seeing smoke in the woods one night in early 1981. Another said he saw a car parked by the logging road, engine running, but didn't recognize it. Those accounts were too vague to confirm. Carol's sister visited the burial site not long after the identification. The cemetery was quiet, surrounded by trees and open fields. The old marker had weathered to gray, the inscription almost unreadable. She replaced it with flowers and a photo, the same smiling girl from 1979. The Bossier Parish Sheriff's Office still lists the case as open. The file now includes a digital composite of Carol's reconstructed face beside her real photograph. They look eerily similar, as though time itself had only been waiting to align them. Today, the site where her remains were found is overgrown, the logging road nearly erased by vegetation. In summer, it smells of pine and damp soil. In winter, the trees stand bare, and the wind moves through them like a low hum. There's no marker, no sign of what happened there. Only a quiet clearing, half hidden by weeds, where a small cross once lay beside the ashes. Australia, 1972. The sound of engines could be heard across the tarmac of Hobart Airport that September morning. The year was 1972. The air was cold and sharp, and the wind moved in long, dry gusts off the mountain. Somewhere on the edge of the field, a small white tiger moth sat ready for flight, its engine idling unevenly, its wings trembling in the wind. Inside the hangar, two people were loading light bags into the cockpit, Brenda Heen and pilot Max Price. They were preparing to fly north across Tasmania, then over the Bass Strait to Canberra. They never arrived. Brenda Heen had been one of the most outspoken conservationists in Tasmania during a time when the island's wilderness was being rapidly cut apart for hydroelectric projects. Her focus had been the flooding of Lake Pedder, a vast, glacial lake in the island's southwest wilderness, surrounded by pink quartzite, sand, and mountains. For thousands of years, it had been untouched. By 1972, the Hydroelectric Commission planned to drown it beneath a dam. Brenda, a church organist and mother of 3 grown children, had taken it personally. To her, it wasn't only about water or land. It was about the moral right to destroy what couldn't be replaced. She wrote letters, gave speeches, and organized protests when almost no one else dared to. In one letter, she said, "We must save something beautiful in the world before it's gone." She became one of the founding members of the Lake Pedder Action Committee, pushing back against the government-backed project. But when local protests failed, she decided to go higher. She and Max Price planned to fly directly to the nation's capital, carrying petitions and letters demanding that the Australian government intervene. On September 8th, 1972, the plan was simple: depart Hobart, refuel in Launceston, and continue across the Bay Strait to Canberra. Brenda's friends had gathered to see her off. She wore a green scarf around her neck, a quiet nod to the movement she represented. The weather that morning wasn't perfect. Clouds were building, and the wind had turned erratic. Still, the flight seemed possible. The Tiger Moth, though old, had flown countless hours before. Around 10 a.m., they taxied to the runway. The plane lifted off smoothly and headed north. It was the last confirmed sighting. When Brenda and Max failed to arrive in Canberra that evening, a search began. Aircraft were sent across Tasmania's north coast and the strait. Locals were questioned, and flight paths were retraced. Nothing was found. No wreckage, no bodies, not even an oil slick. Days turned into weeks. Then rumors began. Some believed the plane had gone down over the water, that strong crosswinds had pushed the Tiger Moth off course, and the light craft had simply disappeared into the sea. Others whispered darker possibilities. The Lake Pedder campaign had made enemies. Brenda had received anonymous phone calls in the weeks before her flight, voices telling her to stop, warning her that accidents happen. Friends later recalled she had seemed uneasy, even frightened, but determined to continue. Some claimed the hangar where the plane had been kept had been broken into before the flight. The locks were found tampered with. Whether anything was taken or altered was never proven. Investigators tried to trace the flight's possible route. The Tiger Moth's limited range and open cockpit would have required multiple stops. Yet no one along the flight path remembered seeing it after departure. The Australian Air Force searched sections of bushland, while volunteer pilots combed the coastlines of northern Tasmania and Flinders Island. The weather had turned stormy, which made visibility almost impossible. For years, the case remained open. Fishermen along the Bay Strait occasionally reported seeing floating debris or fabric caught on coastal rocks, but nothing was verified. The Tiger Moth serial number, VHAIK, never turned up in any registry of recovered wreckage. In Hobart, Brenda's small house remained much as she had left it. On her piano, the sheet music was still open to a hymn she had been practicing for Sunday service. Her friends described her as soft-spoken, but relentless. She had written in her diary the night before she left, "Tomorrow we fly. If we do not speak, at least they will have heard." The loss of Brenda Heen and Max Price became more than a missing persons case. To environmentalists, it became a symbol, though not one they could easily talk about. Many believed, quietly, that the plane had been sabotaged. There were no signs of distress calls, and no evidence of a crash on land or water. The Tiger Moth's old engine could have failed, but the timing, just as Brenda's campaign threatened to draw national attention, was too sharp to ignore. In 1974, a private investigator named Richard Flanagan began digging through records, flight plans, and personal accounts. He discovered inconsistencies in how the search had been conducted. Certain coastal areas had been excluded. The hangar logs didn't fully match witness statements. There was even a gap in airport records from that morning, a missing entry line between departures. None of it proved foul play, but it deepened the uncertainty. By the 1980s, Lake Petter was gone, buried beneath a man-made reservoir. A small group of environmentalists continued to meet annually at the edge of the lake, where the water stretched above what had once been its quartzite beach. They would stand in silence, listening to the wind move across the flooded valley. Someone always mentioned Brenda. In later years, as technology improved, new searches were proposed. In 2008, a sonar team scanned parts of the Bay Strait, but found no trace of the aircraft. Even now, nothing definitive has ever been located. All that remains of that morning are fragments. The noise of the propeller turning against the wind, the green scarf fluttering against the wing strut, the sound of the aircraft fading northward over the hills. Somewhere beyond the edge of Tasmania, in the expanse between land and sea, the flight of Brenda Heen and Max Price ended, quietly, without a signal, without a trace. United States, 2009. The television studio in Orchard Park, New York, sat on a quiet stretch of road south of Buffalo, surrounded by warehouses and half-empty parking lots. It was February 12, 2009, late in the afternoon, when police received a 911 call from a man's cell phone. His voice was calm, almost measured. He said there had been an accident at the Bridges TV station. When officers arrived minutes later, the door was unlocked and the building was silent except for the hum of studio lights. Inside, near the reception area, they found Asiya Zubair Hassan, age 37. She was lying on the floor behind the glass doors, her head and upper body covered with a dark coat. There was blood on the carpet, blood on the walls, and a heavy cutting instrument on the floor nearby. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Within minutes, police identified her husband, Muzammil Hassan, as the man who had made the call. He was the co-founder of the same television station, a small network created in 2004 to present Muslim life and culture in America to a broader audience. The project had gained attention for its message of integration and understanding. Now, its founders were at the center of a crime scene. Witnesses told police that Asiya had come to the studio that afternoon to deliver divorce papers. She had recently separated from her husband and was preparing to finalize the legal proceedings. She was described as calm but cautious, aware that the meeting might turn volatile. Staff members recalled she had arranged for someone to wait for her outside, but when they arrived, the building was already quiet. Detectives pieced together the events from surveillance, phone logs, and witness accounts. Muzammil Hassan had arrived earlier that day, entering through a side door. Shortly after Asiya entered the building, security footage ended. Cameras inside the main office had been disconnected from their power source. What happened next was reconstructed only through evidence. The assault had been sudden and brutal. The weapon, later described in court as a large knife, had been brought from another room. The cause of death was decapitation. There were no signs of a struggle beyond the immediate area, suggesting the attack was over within moments. Afterward, Muzammil drove to a nearby police station and turned himself in. Officers described him as calm, almost detached. He told them, "My wife is dead inside the TV studio." He offered no explanation. Asiya Zubair had been well known in local circles. Educated, professional, and deeply involved in community work. Friends described her as graceful, intelligent, and private about her personal struggles. In the months leading up to her death, she had confided in a few people that her marriage had grown abusive. Police records confirmed 2 prior domestic disturbance reports filed by her in 2007 and 2008, though no arrests were made. The couple's story had once been one of promise. They had founded Bridges TV together, marketing it as the first English-language Muslim television network in North America. The goal, as they said in early press releases, was to counter stereotypes and present balanced portrayals of Muslim Americans. They appeared together in interviews, smiling, articulate, confident. Behind that image, however, Asiya's friends later told investigators, the marriage was marked by fear and control. The case drew immediate media attention. The contrast between the network's message and the crime's brutality dominated headlines. Within days, the phrase honor killing began to appear in articles and broadcasts. Though investigators focused instead on domestic violence, noting the patterns of coercion and threats described by Asia's family. Hassan was charged with second-degree murder and held without bail. His initial court appearance was brief. He stood in a blue jumpsuit, expressionless, speaking only to confirm his name. The investigation revealed a consistent pattern. Friends and colleagues told police that Asia had spent months preparing to leave, consulting an attorney, and moving with her children to a separate residence. She had filed for divorce on February 6th, 6 days before her death. In her filings, she described years of abuse and intimidation. The court granted her an order of protection that same week. Detectives concluded that Hassan had planned the meeting under the pretense of discussing business, but intended confrontation. The disabling of the cameras suggested premeditation. The trial did not begin until 2011. By then, Hassan had dismissed his legal counsel and chosen to represent himself. In long, erratic statements, he claimed he had been the victim of abuse, alleging that Asia had humiliated and manipulated him. He spoke at length, often rambling, at times addressing the jury directly about his business ambitions and his marriage. The prosecution's case was methodical. They presented evidence of planning, the camera disconnections, the sequence of calls, the calm surrender. They showed photographs of the crime scene, the weapon, and the timeline of her protective order. They called witnesses who had seen bruises on Asia in the months prior. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. On February 7th, 2011, almost exactly 2 years after the killing, Muzammil Hassan was found guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. In court, the judge called the act cold-blooded and beyond comprehension. Hassan remained expressionless. He later appealed the verdict, arguing procedural errors, but the conviction was upheld. Bridges TV closed shortly afterward. The studio building remained empty for years, its sign removed, windows shuttered. For a time, it became a symbol in debates about domestic violence and cultural silence. But eventually even that faded. The lot was later converted into a storage facility. Asia's family avoided public attention after the trial. Her children were placed with relatives and later moved out of state. Those who knew her spoke of her in quiet tones, how she had worked to build something meaningful, how she had tried to leave safely, how close she came. In the official records, the case is straightforward. Victim, Asia Zubair Hassan. Cause of death, homicide, blunt and sharp force trauma. Location, Orchard Park, New York. Time, February 12th, 2009. But for those who were there that night, the first responders, the neighbors, the studio staff who arrived later, what remains is the stillness of that space. The empty lobby, the smell of cleaning fluid and steel, the hum of machines left running after the lights were cut. Outside, the February air was dry and cold, snow melting in shallow puddles on the pavement. Officers moved quietly between their vehicles, speaking in low voices. Inside the building, the air hung heavy, and the lights flickered against the glass walls where a reflection still moved briefly before the power went out. United States, 1991. It was early December 1991 in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. The sky hung low and gray over the quiet suburban streets of East Lampeter Township. Inside a small duplex on Lampeter Road, 17-year-old Lori Show was getting ready for school. She was home alone that morning. Her mother, Hazel, had gone out briefly to run an errand. By the time Hazel returned less than an hour later, the house was silent, too silent. In Lori's bedroom, she found her daughter lying on the floor, her throat cut. Lori Show was a high school student, shy, thoughtful, and kind by most accounts. She lived with her mother in a modest 2-story home, and she'd recently ended a brief relationship with a man named Lawrence Butch Yunkin. It had lasted only a short while, but what followed would stretch into months of tension, harassment, and escalating threats, mostly from Yunkin's new girlfriend, a woman named Lisa Michelle Lambert. Lisa was 19, older than Lori by 2 years. After she started dating Yunkin, she began calling Lori's house at night. The calls started as insults and taunts, but quickly turned darker. Lori had told friends and teachers that Lisa followed her to school, threatened to beat her, and once pulled her hair in a parking lot. Hazel reported the harassment to the police, but little was done. By November 1991, Lori had begun avoiding places where she might run into Lisa. She told her mother she just wanted it to stop. Around that same time, Lisa discovered she was pregnant with Yunkin's child. The pregnancy seemed to amplify her obsession with Lori. In her mind, Lori became the reason for every argument, every insecurity. On the evening of December 19th, 1991, Lori attended her usual classes and returned home with her mother. The next morning, Hazel left early to meet Lori's guidance counselor. The school had called about a minor scheduling issue. Hazel left around 7 a.m., locking the front door behind her. Lori was still home, dressed, and preparing to leave for school. When Hazel came back shortly before 8 a.m., the front door was slightly open. She called out. No answer. Upstairs, the bedroom door was ajar. The sight inside was something she never spoke about in full. Lori was lying on her bedroom floor, in her robe, bleeding heavily from her neck and wrists. She had been slashed multiple times, but was still barely alive. Hazel knelt beside her. Lori tried to speak. According to her mother, she whispered one name, Michelle. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but Lori died before reaching the hospital. The scene told a story of struggle. There were signs of forced entry through the back sliding door. A clump of long, dark hair lay near the bed. A pair of sunglasses had been dropped in the hallway. Detectives from East Lampeter Police began their investigation immediately. They interviewed Lori's friends and teachers, who all mentioned the same ongoing conflict with Lisa Lambert. That name came up again and again. Within hours, police questioned both Lambert and Yunkin. Lambert denied everything, insisting she'd been home asleep. Yunkin appeared nervous and evasive. The next day, an anonymous caller tipped police that Lambert and two others, Yunkin and a friend named Tabitha Buck, had been seen together early that morning. Witnesses recalled a small, dark car near Lori's home around 7 a.m. A neighbor remembered hearing screams. Another said they saw two women running from the area. By the following afternoon, all three suspects were in custody. During questioning, Yunkin admitted that he'd driven Lambert and Buck to Lori's house. He claimed he didn't know what Lambert planned to do, that she told him she only wanted to talk to Lori. He said he waited in the car while the two women went inside. Minutes later, they returned, visibly shaken and covered in blood. Lambert reportedly said, "It's done. She won't be bothering us anymore." Tabitha Buck's statement largely matched his. She said Lambert had forced her to participate, threatening her if she refused. Inside the house, according to Buck, Lambert had confronted Lori in her bedroom. There had been a brief struggle. Then Lambert pulled a knife from her coat pocket. Buck ran out of the room. When Lambert emerged, she was holding the knife, breathing hard. When police searched Lambert's home, they found a pair of sneakers stained with what appeared to be blood, a knife matching the wound pattern, and a robe similar to Lori's that had fibers consistent with the victim's carpet. Lambert was charged with first-degree murder. Yunkin and Buck were charged as accomplices. The trial that followed in 1992 drew national attention. Prosecutors described Lambert as jealous, controlling, and consumed by rage. The motive was straightforward. She wanted revenge on the girl she blamed for everything wrong in her life. Witnesses described months of threats, phone calls, and public confrontations. The prosecution's timeline placed the attack between 7:15 and 7:30 a.m., a narrow window when Hazel Show was away from home. Lambert maintained her innocence. She claimed Yunkin had killed Lori and framed her. But physical evidence, the hair, the footprints, and the knife, tied her directly to the scene. After weeks of testimony, the jury found Lambert guilty. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Buck received a lesser sentence for cooperation. Yunkin served time for third-degree murder and later parole violations. Years later, the case would resurface in a strange way. In 1997, Lambert filed a federal appeal, claiming her trial had been corrupted by police misconduct and fabricated evidence. A federal judge temporarily vacated her conviction, citing irregularities in the original investigation. For a few months, she was free. Then, in 1998, the Third Circuit Court reinstated her conviction. She returned to prison. For Hazel's show, none of it changed anything. Her daughter's room remained the same. On Lori's desk, her schoolbooks stayed stacked in neat piles. In Lancaster, people still talk about the case. The town has grown, but the small duplex on Lampeter Road still stands, repainted and quiet. Neighbors say they sometimes see the light flicker in the upstairs window, though the house has changed hands many times. What remains most unsettling about Lori's disappearance from the world that morning isn't just the violence of it, but how quickly it unfolded. How ordinary things seemed before, how silent the neighborhood was after. A phone call that went unanswered. A door left open. A mother walking into the house and calling her daughter's name. And upstairs, the sound of nothing at all. United States, 2007. It was a warm August afternoon in 2007 in Bloomington, Indiana. The cicadas were loud, the air heavy with heat. 17-year-old Jillian Meyer left her part-time job at a local bookstore just after 5 p.m. She told her coworkers she was going home to change before meeting friends for dinner. She never arrived. Her silver Honda Civic was found the next morning, parked crookedly at the edge of a gravel turnout off State Road 37, a few miles south of town. The driver's door was unlocked. Her purse, phone, and keys were still inside. The car's hazard lights were off, the engine cold. The ground around the car was undisturbed, except for a single set of footprints leading toward the tree line and vanishing into the brush. Jillian lived with her parents in a small house near Cascades Park. She was in her last year of high school, quiet but dependable, the kind of person people described as cautious. She didn't drink, didn't smoke, rarely stayed out late. She was supposed to meet two friends that night at a diner on Kirkwood Avenue. When she didn't show up, they assumed she'd gone home early. By the next morning, her parents had filed a missing person report. Detectives from the Monroe County Sheriff's Department began by retracing her route, a short 15-minute drive from her workplace to her home. Traffic cameras captured her car heading west along the highway at 5:22 p.m. The image showed sunlight flashing across her windshield, her silhouette faint behind the glass. That was the last confirmed sighting. Search teams combed the roadside where her car was found. Dogs tracked a scent for less than 50 yards before losing it in the undergrowth. Helicopters scanned the wooded hillsides. Nothing turned up. Detectives questioned coworkers, friends, and anyone who had seen her in the hours before she disappeared. One coworker recalled a man waiting in the bookstore parking lot around closing time. Tall, thin, wearing a gray baseball cap. No one saw him leave. The security camera pointed toward the lot had been malfunctioning that week. A local resident who lived near the turnout reported hearing a car door slam around 6 p.m., followed by the sound of another engine idling briefly before driving away. She hadn't thought much of it until news of the missing girl broke the next day. The days that followed were methodical. Officers marked grids along the wooded area, cataloged tire impressions, photographed boot prints. Some of the impressions matched the shoes Jillian was believed to have been wearing, white sneakers with a worn tread. Others were larger, deeper, made by someone heavier. The ground near the footprints showed a faint drag mark leading several feet into the brush before stopping abruptly. No blood was found. Detectives sent out alerts across county lines. Her phone records showed the last activity at 5:24 p.m., a text message to a friend reading, "Heading home now." The phone never connected again. By the end of the first week, state police joined the investigation. They drained a small retention pond near the highway turnout. They searched abandoned barns and culverts. They found nothing belonging to her. Interviews expanded to anyone with recent violent offenses or abduction attempts in the region. Several persons of interest emerged: a delivery driver who frequented the highway, a construction worker who quit his job the day after she vanished, but none of them were charged. Each lead dissolved under lack of evidence. A month later, hunters reported finding a torn piece of light fabric deep in the woods 5 miles west of the search area. It matched the blouse Jillian had been wearing that day. DNA confirmed it was hers. The surrounding ground revealed no additional clues. No bones, no jewelry, no phone. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit became involved in early 2008. Their assessment suggested a targeted abduction, likely by someone familiar with her routine. The lack of signs of struggle near the car pointed to either a sudden confrontation or voluntary exit under deception. A year later, the case went cold. The Honda Civic was returned to her family. They kept it in their garage, untouched. Her bedroom remained as it had been, neatly ordered, her work apron still hanging behind the door. In 2011, a construction crew working near Lake Lemon uncovered fragments of bone along a dry creek bed. Forensic testing identified them as belonging to a young woman, but not to Jillian. By 2014, the wooded stretch along State Road 37 had changed. New housing developments had gone up. The turnout where the Honda was found had been paved over. The trees were gone. Investigators still kept the case file open. 412 pages of reports, photographs, and evidence logs. The last entry, dated 2019, noted an interview with a truck driver who claimed to have picked up a young woman matching Jillian's description near Martinsville the same evening she vanished. He said she seemed calm, said little, and got out at a gas station 20 miles north. No footage existed to confirm it. There were no more sightings after that. The file remains active. The silver Honda, still in her parents' garage, sits under a cover, dust settling on the hood. The seats hold the faint smell of sunscreen and paperbacks. The odometer reads the same number it did that day. The last known trace of Jillian Meyer is the trail of footprints ending where the trees begin, fading into the thick heat of an August evening. Germany, 1984. The town of Bad Godesberg sat quiet along the Rhine that October morning in 1984. The mist was low, the air sharp with the smell of wet leaves and river water. At 6:40 a.m., a man walking his dog near the south edge of the park noticed something pale lying in the grass just beyond a stand of birch trees. It was the body of 24-year-old Bridget Shine. She had been stabbed multiple times. Her clothing was torn. Her purse and shoes were missing. Bridget lived in Bonn, where she worked as a secretary for a small logistics company. She'd gone out the night before to meet friends at a nearby cafe. They said she left just after 10 p.m., planning to take the short tram ride home. She never arrived. Her apartment, a small flat on Königswinter Strasse, was locked from the outside. Nothing inside was disturbed. Police traced her last confirmed movements through the tram system. Several witnesses recalled seeing her on line 62 heading toward Bad Godesberg. One remembered her standing near the door, holding a paperback book. Around 10:45 p.m., she got off at the Rheinallee stop. No one saw what happened after that. Detectives from the Bonn Kriminalpolizei arrived at the park just before sunrise. They cordoned off a wide section of grassland bordered by trees and a narrow footpath. The body lay face down, her hair damp from the night air. There were drag marks leading from the path to where she was found, about 15 meters. The ground was churned in patches, indicating a brief struggle. No signs of sexual assault were conclusive, but her clothing was in disarray. A broken wristwatch was found near the edge of the path. The glass was cracked. The hand stopped at 10:56 p.m. nearby. Investigators recovered a single earring, silver, with a small pearl at its center. The matching piece was later found in her handbag, discovered 2 days later at a bus stopped a kilometer away. Residents in the area reported hearing a scream sometime between 10:45 and 11 p.m., followed by the sound of running footsteps. One woman said she looked out from her balcony and saw a man in a dark coat moving quickly toward the main road. She couldn't see his face. By noon, the case had drawn national attention. The murder of a young woman in a quiet riverside neighborhood unsettled the entire region. Police canvassed every building along the tram route, interviewed commuters, and collected fingerprints from the park railings and benches. None matched anyone in the local criminal database. The autopsy confirmed multiple stab wounds to the chest and abdomen. The blade used was narrow and long, likely from a kitchen or utility knife. Time of death was estimated around 11 p.m. Toxicology tests found no drugs or alcohol in her system. A week later, detectives received an anonymous call. The male voice claimed to have seen Bridget talking to a man outside the tram station that night. The caller said the man was tall, with light hair, wearing a brown jacket. When police traced the call, it had been made from a payphone near the Bonn Hauptbahnhof. The caller never identified himself. In the months that followed, more than 300 tips came in. One pointed to a former co-worker who had shown an unusual interest in Bridget. Another focused on a local laborer with a record of assaults. Both men were questioned extensively. Neither could be linked to the crime. The investigation slowed, but never stopped. By early 1985, the case file had filled several binders: crime scene photos, interview transcripts, tram schedules, and forensic analyses. Nothing connected. In 1986, 2 years after the murder, a man serving time for burglary in Cologne claimed to know who killed Bridget. He named another inmate, a transient laborer who'd worked construction sites in Bonn during the autumn of 1984. Detectives interviewed the man, but his DNA did not match samples taken from the scene. Forensic work in the 1980s was limited. The small traces of biological evidence, hair fibers, partial prints, and blood were logged and stored. Decades later, they would be tested again with modern techniques. In 2009, cold case investigators reopened the file. The DNA analysis ruled out previous suspects, but identified an unknown male profile. The profile was entered into Germany's national database. No match was found. Over the years, theories shifted. Some believed she was attacked by a stranger, a random act of violence along a poorly lit path. Others thought she knew her killer, that the meeting at the tram stop was planned. Her friends insisted she hadn't been seeing anyone. Her parents, who lived in Siegburg, said she was cautious, often carrying pepper spray in her handbag. The broken watch remained one of the few solid anchors in the timeline. Investigators determined it had stopped due to impact, possibly during the initial assault. The time, 10:56, fit almost perfectly between her departure from the tram and the estimated time of death. In 2015, a man cleaning out his late father's belongings in nearby Königswinter turned in a rusted knife found wrapped in cloth inside an old toolbox. It matched the general description of the weapon, but the corrosion had erased any usable evidence. Police examined it, noted the find, and filed it under supplementary materials. The small memorial that once stood near the birch trees eventually faded. A weathered photograph, a few stones, and a single metal plaque bearing her name. Locals walking dogs still sometimes stop there, though many no longer remember the reason. The park remains much the same. The path has been repaved, the lampposts replaced, but the outline of the trees hasn't changed. Early in the morning, the fog still drifts low over the grass, and the river can be heard beyond the levee. Somewhere between the tram stop and the line of trees, in the few silent minutes before 11 p.m., Bridget Cheyenne vanished from the moving rhythm of the city, leaving behind only the faint sound of footsteps, the broken watch, and the still air of an October night along the Rhine. United States, 2018. It was early evening in Washington, D.C. on September 18, 2018. The air was still warm from the day, the streets carrying that late summer quiet that settles after rush hour. At 7:45 p.m., 28-year-old Wendy Martinez left her apartment near Logan Circle for a jog. She ran most evenings, following the same route through her neighborhood, a loop past Church Street, down toward 14th, then around to the park. She was wearing gray leggings, a yellow tank top, and running shoes. She carried her phone in one hand, her keys in the other. At 7:54 p.m., she made her last call. Wendy had recently become engaged. She worked as a technology consultant and had just returned from visiting family in Florida. Her friends described her as organized, disciplined, cautious. She preferred running before sunset on familiar streets. The night she disappeared, she sent a quick text to her fiancé, going for a short run. Minutes later, a 911 call came from a small coffee shop on P Street NW. The caller's voice was shaky. A woman had staggered inside, bleeding heavily from her neck and chest, collapsing near the counter. Witnesses rushed to help, pressing napkins and towels to her wounds. One of them, a barista, later told police she kept trying to say something but couldn't form words. Paramedics arrived within minutes. She was pronounced dead shortly after reaching the hospital. The victim was identified as Wendy Karina Martinez. The attack had occurred less than a block from a shop near the intersection of 11th and P Streets. Surveillance cameras from nearby businesses captured fragments of the scene. A figure running, a flash of movement in the corner of the frame, then another figure fleeing into the darkness. Detectives from a Metropolitan Police Department sealed off the area and began combing through the footage. In one clip, a man in dark clothing could be seen standing on the sidewalk minutes before the attack. He held an object in his right hand, partially obscured by his sleeve. When Wendy ran past, he turned sharply, following her. Seconds later, she stumbled into the coffee shop. The footage provided the first real lead. A tall man, medium build, wearing a white baseball cap, dark hoodie, and sweatpants. He disappeared northbound, out of camera range. Overnight, police canvassed the area, collecting witness statements. One resident said she saw a man matching the description crouched behind a car shortly before 8 p.m. Another recalled hearing a woman scream, a single sharp sound, followed by running footsteps. By morning, the case had already made national headlines. The image of a young professional attacked at random while jogging through a well-lit city neighborhood spread quickly. Police increased patrols and released stills from the surveillance video. At 11 p.m. the next night, an officer on patrol near the intersection of 14th and Columbia Road noticed a man sitting alone on a park bench, wearing a sweatshirt with dried stains on the sleeves. When approached, the man stood abruptly and began walking away. He was detained minutes later. His name was Anthony Crawford. Crawford, 23, had a record of minor arrests, trespassing, disorderly conduct, theft. In his possession, officers found a folding knife with traces of what appeared to be blood. Lab tests later confirmed it matched Winnie Martinez's DNA. During questioning, Crawford spoke little. He gave no explanation for the attack, no motive, no statement of remorse. Detectives found no prior connection between him and Wendy. The two had never met. The murder weapon was traced to a local hardware store. The knife had been purchased only days before. The clothes seen in the surveillance footage were recovered from a dumpster behind an abandoned building on Girard Street. The stains on them matched the crime scene. The timeline became clear. At 7:45 p.m., Wendy began her run. Around 7:52 p.m., Crawford was seen walking aimlessly near P Street, carrying the knife. At 7:53 p.m., she passed him. The attack occurred in seconds. A sudden lunge, a struggle, a series of quick motions. She ran toward the cafe, collapsing inside. Crawford turned and vanished into the side streets. The autopsy revealed 7 stab wounds to the neck, torso, and back. The pattern was erratic, indicating a fast, frenzied assault rather than a planned one. Toxicology showed no defensive substances, no drugs. She had been healthy, alert, running at a steady pace before the attack. Investigators found no indication of robbery or sexual assault. Her phone and keys were recovered nearby. The motive remained unclear. Within a week, Crawford was charged with first-degree murder while armed. He was ordered held without bond. The court filings described the act as random and unprovoked. Friends and family gathered at the small church near DuPont Circle where Wendy had attended services. Her fiancé arrived from Florida. The details of the attack remained sealed under ongoing investigation, but the timeline stayed consistent. Less than 10 minutes from the time she left home to the moment she fell inside the cafe. The neighborhood changed after that. Streetlights were repaired, cameras added. The intersection where it happened became busier, noisier. The cafe reopened within days, its floor scrubbed clean, the same quiet hum of espresso machines returning. Crawford eventually pled guilty in 2019 to first-degree murder. During sentencing, he stared straight ahead, silent, his hands clasped in front of him. Outside, the late summer air still carried that faint electric warmth. The same streets she had run through every night, the same route traced on her phone's running app. A perfect loop cut off mid-track at 7:54 p.m. The time between her last step and the sound of the cafe door opening was 41 seconds. United States, 1994. It began with a knock at the door. On the evening of September 24th, 1994, 16-year-old Lisa Renee was alone in her family's apartment in Arlington, Texas. Her sister, Perline, and brother, Andrew, had gone out for the evening. Lisa stayed behind, doing homework and talking on the phone with a friend. Around 8:30 p.m., she told a friend someone was knocking. She sounded uneasy. Moments later, the line went silent. When her siblings returned around 11:30, the apartment was empty. The front door stood open. Lisa's books were scattered on the floor, her phone dangling from the cord. Outside, neighbors had seen a dark car idling nearby, then speeding off. Lisa Renee had vanished. She was born in St. Croix, part of the U.S. Virgin Islands, and had moved to Texas with her family only a few years earlier. She was quiet, soft-spoken, with a gentle sense of humor and good grades. Her disappearance didn't fit any familiar pattern. No troubled background, no reason to run away. By morning, the Arlington Police Department had opened a full missing person investigation. The FBI joined quickly. What emerged over the following days was a story of mistaken revenge and deliberate cruelty. 5 men, Orlando Hall, Bruce Webster, Demetrius Hall, Stephen Beckley, and Marvin Holloway, were at the center of it. They were drug traffickers operating out of Pine Bluff, Arkansas. A few days earlier, they had been robbed during a marijuana deal. They believed the culprits were Lisa's brothers. They weren't, but the men drove to Arlington anyway, planning to find Renee brothers and force them to return the money. When they couldn't locate them, they decided to target Lisa instead. Phone records and witness statements later pieced together the timeline. Around 8:30 p.m., the men knocked on the door of the family's apartment, pretending to be police. Lisa, frightened, called her friend. She said there were men outside claiming to have a warrant. The friend told her not to open the door. She didn't, but the men broke in. Neighbors heard screams. A young woman's voice shouting, "Help me! Help me!" One neighbor looked out and saw her being forced into a car, a green Chevrolet Caprice. The vehicle drove north. Over the next 12 hours, Lisa was transported from Texas to Arkansas. The men stopped along the way, switching drivers, buying gas, and discussing what to do with her. At one stop near Benton, Arkansas, they took her into a motel room. Witnesses later testified that she was crying and begging to go home. They assaulted her repeatedly through the night. In the early morning hours of September 25th, they drove her to Bird Lake Park, a wooded area near Pine Bluff. They dragged her out of the car, still alive, and led her into the forest. She was beaten and raped again. Then they dug a shallow grave among the pines. One of the men hit her over the head with a shovel until she stopped moving. They covered her body with dirt and branches. By the time investigators found her remains a week later, the air had turned cool and damp. The forest floor was dark with early autumn decay. Her body was identified through dental records. The case moved swiftly through the courts. Each man was tried separately. Orlando Hall, described by prosecutors as the ringleader, was sentenced to death in 1995. Bruce Webster received a death sentence as well, though was later vacated due to intellectual disability. The others received life sentences. Hall's execution was delayed for 25 years. He spent those decades on federal death row, appealing his conviction and filing for clemency. None were granted. On November 19, 2020, he was executed by lethal injection at the federal prison in Terre Haute, Indiana. Witnesses said he remained calm as he was led into the chamber. When asked for final words, he apologized to Lisa's family and said he took full responsibility. The injection began at 11:47 p.m. He was pronounced dead 15 minutes later. Back in Arlington, the Renee family had long since left the apartment where it happened. The building still stands, an ordinary block of beige and brick, identical to dozens like it in the city's quiet neighborhoods. There is no plaque or marker, nothing to show where the knock came or how long she hesitated before answering the door. Just a narrow concrete walkway, and behind it, the small window that looked out onto the parking lot, where the green Caprice waited with its engine running.